Silent Hill 2 is a masterpiece. There's no arguing that. And we wouldn't have this wonderful work of terrifying horror without another work which came more than 100 years before it. In fact, without this novel, Silent Hill 2 as we know it simply wouldn't exist. Let's dive in and take a look at the world-renowned Russian crime novel, Crime and Punishment. Published in serial installments in 1866, Crime and Punishment is a deeply psychological story written by Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky. It was his first major work and made a huge impact. Movies and plays were adapted from it, it was translated multiple times, and if you live in the US like I do, you probably read it or at least heard about it in school. On the surface, it's easy to see how it ties to Silent Hill 2. Man commits crime, man is punished. But there's so much more tying these stories together. In fact, the horror and the atmosphere of the Silent Hill series as a whole owes a lot to this deeply upsetting novel. Our protagonist is a young man in his early 20s named Raskolnikov. He's a former student, down on his luck, living in poverty. His mother and sister are also deeply poor, and in an effort to survive, his sister Dunya plans to marry a rich jerk-ass named Lucin. Time is running out. Raskolnikov is desperate to find a way to help his family escape their horrible living situation. He has a plan. For the first few chapters of the book, we don't know what this plan is, only that he's terrified to do it. He can hardly believe he's conceived it and goes back and forth on whether or not to go through with it. His plan is, of course, to commit a murder. There's a woman, an old pawnbroker, who is cruel and unkind and has a lot of money. She's abusive to her lovely younger sister and is obviously a stain on the world. No one would miss her. That's what Raskolnikov tells himself when he goes to her house with an axe and kills her. Things immediately go wrong. The younger sister, an innocent, comes home and finds him, and he's forced to kill her too. He panics, unable to take all the money and valuables, and later buries what he did take and never touches it again. From the moment of the murder, he falls into madness and despair, becoming more and more unhinged, seeing hallucinations, forgetting things, fainting, growing feverish, speaking like a madman. Sound familiar? Raskolnikov tries to justify his actions to himself, but subconsciously he knows he's guilty of a great wrong. The division in himself between his conscious and unconscious mind leads to fever dreams, waking nightmares, illusions, and lost memories that drive him mad. He dreams of blood and violence, and ordinary everyday sights become nightmares to him. At one point he wanders town for 6 hours before returning, and how and where he came back, he did not remember. He has a terrible vision that his landlady is being beaten to death. It was dusk when he was woken by a fearful scream. He had never heard such unnatural sounds, such howling, wailing, grinding, tears, blows, and curses. He could never have imagined such brutality, such frenzy. Terror gripped his heart like ice, tortured him and numbed him. But in the morning, he finds out it never happened. It was all in his head. He has dreams in which a dying horse is beaten to death violently by laughing drunks. He walks down the street and sees a pub full of people, and it looks nightmarish to him. He hears women shrieking and is terrified. His dreams bring terrible visions of people laughing and mocking him, such as this scene that reimagines his murder. He noticed in the corner between the window and the little cupboard something like a cloak hanging on the wall. Why is that cloak there, he thought. It wasn't there before. He went up to it quietly and felt that there was someone hiding behind it. He cautiously moved the cloak and saw, sitting on a chair in the corner, the old woman bent double so that he couldn't see her face. He took the axe and struck her on the skull. The old woman was sitting and laughing, shaking with noiseless laughter. Suddenly he imagined that the door from the bedroom was ajar and that there was laughter and whispering inside. He began hitting the old woman on the head with all his strength, but at every blow of the axe, the laughter and whispering from the bedroom grew louder, and the old woman was actually shaking with amusement. He was rushing away, but the passage was full of people. The doors of the apartment stood open on the landing, on the stairs, and everywhere below there were people, rows of heads, all looking, huddled together in silence and expectation. He tried to scream and woke up. What do all of these nightmarish things sound like? These dreams and visions are torments created by Raskolnikov's guilt, manifestations that force him to face the truth. They are much like Silent Hill's Otherworld, terrible visions where ordinary things become awful in context, where death and violence are abundant, where terrible noises and smells are everywhere. Many of the visuals in the book feel much like the horrible things we see in Silent Hill. Raskolnikov isn't just a murderer who is eventually caught. He admits to his guilt and turns himself in. And he does this because his conscience torments him, because he is driven mad by his guilt and forced to face the truth. It breaks him, and he surrenders to the law. It is very similar to what happens to James, to his torment in the town, which eventually shatters his delusions. The difference is what delusions are being shattered. James erased all memory of his crime. Raskolnikov remembered his murders, but tried to justify them, to say that they were deserved and he had the right to do it. Another theme in the novel is the association between guilt and illness, or madness, specifically that this illness manifests itself in the guilty and changes them, pulling them into another world of madness and violence. Doesn't this sound familiar? As soon as he is ill, as soon as the normal earthly order of the organism is broken, he begins to realize the possibility of another world. And the more seriously ill he is, the closer becomes his contact with that other world, so that as soon as the man dies, he steps straight into that world. The idea of illness and madness opening the door to another world is right there in Silent Hill 2 as well, specifically in this note from the hospital. The potential for this illness exists in all people, and under the right circumstances, any man or woman would be driven, like him, to the other side. The other side perhaps may not be the best way to phrase it. After all, there is no wall between here and there. It lies on the border where reality and unreality intersect. Here's another quote from Crime and Punishment, which eerily mirrors these ideas. In our legal practice, there was a case of morbid psychology. A man confessed to murder and how he kept it up. It was regular hallucination. He brought forward facts, he imposed upon everyone, and why? He had been partly, but only partly, unintentionally the cause of a murder, and when he knew that he had given the murderers the opportunity, he sank into dejection. It got on his mind and turned his brain. He began imagining things and persuaded himself that he was the murderer. You may drive yourself into delirium if you have the impulse to work upon your nerves. It's all illness. Committing so heinous a crime as murder is too much for the human mind. It breaks them, makes them ill, and pushes them into another world that no one else can see. Raskolnikov has terrible hallucinations and dreams that no one else sees or understands. Another character named Svidrigailov, who is also a murderer, speaks of seeing ghosts that no one else can see. Do you believe in ghosts? Do you see them? Marfa Petrovna is pleased to visit me, he said, twisting his mouth into a strange smile. She has been 3 times. I saw her first on the very day of the funeral, an hour after she was buried. I was wide awake every time. The woman he killed was his wife, Marfa Petrovna, and her appearing to him after her murder to torment him is very similar to Mary and Maria's role with James in Silent Hill 2. The novel puts forward the idea that this madness, this illness of guilt, can only end in one of 2 ways, prison or suicide. Svidrigailov, the second murderer, shoots himself after suffering from his guilt and having the same types of hallucinations as Raskolnikov. The lead character eventually is broken by his guilt and turns himself in. There is no other way to escape this madness, according to the story. That sheds an interesting light on Silent Hill 2, since the characters who are guilty of murder also end up forced into this divide. Either they admit to being guilty or they die. Eddie refuses to admit his guilt. He blames everyone else and is unable to come to terms with it, so he's killed. Angela also cannot come to terms with what she's done, blaming herself, and we presume she kills herself off screen. Only James, who can come to terms with his guilt and admit to it, can walk away. Crime and Punishment uses vivid, horrifying imagery to show how one man's guilt slowly tears away at his mental state and leaves him ill. Yet it also leads him to salvation and eventually forgiveness. It is a story of how suffering for your crimes can be redemptive, how guilt and regret can eat away at you and destroy you. Silent Hill 2 draws its major narrative themes from the book, and also seems to have pulled a good deal of lore and imagery from many of Raskolnikov's rantings and terrible nightmares. The book is old and somewhat hard to read. I recommend getting a more modern translation, or perhaps checking out Crime and Punishment: A Falsified Romance, which is a manga adaptation that reimagines the story in modern-day Japan. It is a fascinating, truly upsetting novel about the depravities of the human mind and the redemption of the soul.